Great. So welcome everyone to Consulting 101. I'm the Business Finance and Consulting Industry Advisor, Julia. And today we're going to talk a little bit about, oh, so our agenda for today. We'll be going through an industry overview and I'll explain, exactly what is consulting, what can you expect. Then I will talk through who are the major players, right? The major players, not just in terms of like who's out there, but also who recruits at Georgetown, because I know that's a common question that comes up a lot during my appointments. And then what do these major players look for, right? What are the common attributes they want to see you demonstrate through your resume, through your cover letter, through your interview, so on and so forth. Then I'm going to walk you through the recruiting process of what you can expect this upcoming fall semester. Please note that while we're planning for everything to be virtual, we understand that this is just kind of like a moving piece all the time. And so we'll absolutely let everyone know in terms of whether or not the recruiting status of things being virtual changes. You absolutely will all know. But at least in terms of timelines and like what you can expect in terms of what it looks like for applications, interviews, so on and so forth, I'll definitely walk you all through that. And then some next steps, right? What you can be doing to prepare now, between now and the fall when it all begins. And then I'll leave some time for Q&A at the end. Great. So to begin, what is consulting? So when it comes to consulting, you're being hired for one of three reasons. A client can't solve their problem on their own, right? So sometimes clients, they've been doing the job for a really long time and they are very used to, right, like what they know of their industry, what they know of their company, so much so that they can't, perhaps they're too in the weeds to be able to pinpoint why isn't a certain service line making money, right? Or why is it that something that we put out there is not getting as much enthusiasm as we thought, even though we did all the research, right? So sometimes they can't solve the problem on their own and they want to bring someone external to help provide another perspective. Another reason, a client does not want to fill a job function they currently have open. For example, so when different companies are transforming their HR processes or perhaps they're transforming the IT solutions that they use, they're not looking to hire like 20 consultants to walk them through the transition and then keep all of them on board, because after a while, the consultants are there to help implement, right, and help strategize how that goes. But once the system is implemented and running smoothly, they don't necessarily need the consultants anymore, right? And they're not trying to hire another 20 to 50 people or however many people it would take. They're looking to hire a few. They're looking to partner with a few people for a short amount of time to get what needs to get done, and then right resume their normal operations and without the consultant. So that's something else. And then another reason, a client is looking for a skill set they do not presently have. So maybe you're a mom and pop shop and you're trying to decide, right, whether or not you should begin franchising. They may not have anyone in the company that knows how to franchise and how to expand. That's where consultants come in, right? You all, if you decide to go into consulting, you'll be equipped with a very specific kind of problem solving skill set, and you'll be able to help, whether it's a mom and pop shop trying to franchise, or whether it's, a healthcare system trying to figure out how to make things more efficient. Sometimes it's not their expertise or their specialty to be able to solve these problems. That's where consultants come in. So simply put, consulting is glorified problem solving. I really can't stress this enough, right? Any organization, government entity, company in the private sector, right? They're all going to come across problems. Some of them they can solve themselves, some of them they can't. And that's where consulting firms step in. So why the hype, right? I imagine there's lots of talk about consulting in the Georgetown community. I hear it all the time from my students. And so some of the major things that do attract a lot of different people to consulting. So one, broad exposure. You're exposed to a variety of different problems across many industries. So your clients can range, like I said, right, from government entities to hospital systems to food packaging companies to, specific cities that are like looking to like develop public health initiatives, right, related to COVID or whatnot. So you get a lot of broad exposure. You can go into like niche consulting, right? So if you want to solve a very specific kind of problem or solve problems within a specific kind of industry, that's definitely possible, right? There's defense consulting, IT consulting, sustainability consulting, so on and so forth. You might get a wide variety of different clients and different projects, but then you would know overarchingly it might be within a specific industry. But all of that is to say, right, a lot of people like the exposure and the variety that they get to experience from client to client, industry to industry, so on and so forth. Next, hands-on experience, right? So as a consultant, you will always be working in teams and you're a valued member expected to pull your weight. So you're not just going to be necessarily, right, a cog in the machine, but I mean, to be fair, you're still going to have to do grunt work. But what it does mean is that you have a lot of hands-on experience. If you're in, for instance, strategy consulting, you'll be interfacing with C-level executives and higher level leadership to help determine strategy and direction for perhaps a company or specific division. You not only get to work in teams and get great client exposure, but right within the teams, it's not just you and three other new consultants. It's people that have been in the firm anywhere between 5 and 10 years, all of whom are actively participating in this client project, which you also get to participate in. And then finally, road warrior. I'm going to say this with a caveat, right? That the pandemic has obviously changed what is and isn't normal when it comes to traveling. But for a very long time, and I do suspect that it will return to this, consultants, right? They travel to wherever their firm is located, whether that's around the US or sometimes around the world, right? Because um, as much as we all enjoy Zoom meetings and phone calls and whatnot, there is some part of the work that requires you to go to the actual site to be able to talk with stakeholders and constituents that the company and or client wants you to speak to, right? And so right now, I know that a lot of travel has been suspended, but I would say that as life returns to pre-pandemic normals, I think there will still be some element of travel involved. Do I think it'll be quite to the level of before? Perhaps not, but who's to say what it will look like? But I will say, regardless of what happens, some element of right being able to amass hotel and airline points as you're traveling to and from your home base to wherever the client project is, I think that will be just a part of the industry. I forgot to put up a slide on here that talks kind of about the downsides, but I did just at least want to mention a few different things. So one, while your hours are not to investment banking level hours, you're still going to be working beyond 40 hours a week. I would say you can probably expect perhaps a 60 to 80-hour work week. So it's right, it's not a 9 to 5 job. And if that's a deal breaker, that's something that I would encourage you to consider. In terms of the road warrior uh, lifestyle aspect, there are some people that really enjoy sleeping in their own bed every single day, right? Day in and day out. If that's something that's important to you, perhaps there's more room for you to be able to finagle that now, but that's just, right, again, something to keep in mind. I think the other thing that I want to say is that even though I'm mentioning that you will have broad exposure to a lot of problems, different industries, you'll have, access to senior execs or whatnot, you're still going to be entering as an entry level analyst or consultant to many different firms. And while you may have these opportunities that I'm talking about, it is not the norm, right? It is not the default. Understand that just like any entry level job, there's going to be some grunt work involved. There's going to be, days of data analysis and pouring through Excel, so on and so forth. So I want to be able to lay out the realities of a career in consulting, understanding that there's going to be some unglamorous parts about it too. And to be honest, right, when you're in information sessions, it's very easy to get caught up in the great stories of like, I got to fly here and do this. And yes, right, I don't discount that. Alums have definitely had wonderful experiences in consulting firms, but also, right, take it with a grain of salt, take stock of, right, how many years has this alum been working in this company, right? Is that something I could do like straight out of undergrad, or do I have to work a few years to a specific level where I would be able to have those opportunities presented to me? So that's just something that I wanted to keep in mind for you all. So next slide. I just wanted to provide an example of what consulting has an impact to do. So this is an example laid out by one of the consulting firms that that recruits at Georgetown. So there was a time, that I was aware of. Perhaps some of you were aware of too, but I was definitely aware of, where you didn't used to have to pay for airline baggage fees, which is, I know, mind blowing, right? But did you know that a consulting firm is responsible for airline baggage fees? In fact, everything from probably needing to pay for the right to choose your seat to uh, like priority boarding and whatnot, because all those services have costs associated with that. That didn't always used to be the case. And some of those are direct and indirect results from a consulting solution. So what was the problem? So in the mid 2000s, airline carriers were having trouble covering costs due to post 9/11 flight hesitancy and high oil prices impacting the industry. So not that many people were flying, right? So what was the solution? A consulting team, they proposed implementing baggage fees as a way to increase revenue streams for a US carrier. And as a result, once this first US carrier implemented baggage fees, literally all major US airlines, except for Southwest, implemented these fees from February to May 2008, right? And so in the span of 4 months, almost all the major US airlines implemented these baggage fees. And then what this solution was the catalyst for airlines charging for services that were previously included in ticket prices. What's crazy though is that this solution, right, was credited with helping to stabilize the industry. And from 2008 to 2011, non-ticket revenue reported by airlines around the world more than doubled. This is not a fake, right? This is not fake news. This is a very real thing that happened. I have the source if you want to go and read it, or if you just Google airline baggage fees consulting, you'll be able to find the story behind it. So this is just a real life example, right, of what this process looks like. What was the industry? Airline carriers. What was their problem? They were having trouble covering costs, right? And what was the solution that consultants came up with? Probably through lots of research that, right, isn't covered in my very brief example here. Probably, right, research, analyzing revenue streams, making hypothetical situations to see what possible revenue streams could bring in the least amount of money, and contrasting that with effort required for implementation, for so on and so forth, right? And this was a pretty easy one. So this is just one example of a kind of client project that you may get called into. So next slide. So what are the different types of consulting? So first, there's strategy consulting. So strategy consultants are hired to provide strategic advice on specific management topics, which I know it sounds very broad, but basically this kind of work focuses on the big picture questions and strategic direction. So basically, right, before you, I would say, like, it's not necessarily in the weeds, nitty gritty kind of work. It's more like, right, big picture thinking, vision casting, and or, so for instance, let's say that you were to, like a company is acquiring another company. Some of the strategy consulting involved would be, okay, how do we mesh the two companies together? Not the logistics of, right, like actually how many people go into each department, but more like overall, how does this affect the vision, right? How does this affect our overarching objectives? How do we incorporate the strengths of the company we acquired into the existing parent company? How can we strengthen, right? What are the economies of scale that we can utilize, right? And so that's a little bit of strategy consulting. So management consulting is a broader umbrella that can include strategy consulting, but typically what management consulting involves is implementing the actual change in an organization. This could be operations based, or it could be executing an already determined solution, right? So like, let's say you already so maybe the strategy consultant comes up with the fact that, like, HR needs a lot of work for a different firm. Um, and maybe they provide the solution of like, here's training, here's software, here's all these things that can benefit HR. If that company decides to proceed with implementing, they would bring in management consultants, right, to figure out like what are the logistics, right? How do we implement like oh, I forgot the software name, but you get what I mean. Like, how do we actually implement the software, right? What is the timeline upon which we can have everyone join the platform? How do we go about training, right? Who holds it? How often do we hold it? How do we have continued training moving forward for everyone that wasn't able to attend at first, right? And so that's a little bit of management consulting. And then there's niche consulting. So niche consulting is comprised of boutique and or smaller firms that specialize in a particular field, like I mentioned earlier, right? It could be healthcare, it could be HR, defense, IT, so on and so forth. So, which firms recruit at Georgetown? This is a question I get a lot. Know that this is just I mean, to be honest, it covers pretty broadly a decent majority of the firms that recruit at Georgetown, but no, there are definitely other boutique firms or just, firms not quite to the scale that aren't included here. But for the main ones, right, you have the elites, which is McKinsey, Bain, and BCG, otherwise known as MBB. These are the oldest, sorry, these are the oldest consulting firms. Right, they're also the most prestigious. They want the cream of the cream of the crop, which many of all of you, I'm sure, fall into. Um, so we have relationships with, I mean, all these companies on here, but definitely within McKinsey, Bain, BCG, right? They recruit at Georgetown every year. I will say that McKinsey and Bain are more proactive in having information sessions in the pre-pandemic times, right? Actually on campus. BCG does a little bit more like you can come, we'll host you in our office, or you can come to our webinars throughout the course of the summer versus them saying to us at Georgetown, hey, we want to put something on Handshake, right? Or so on and so forth. So you're not going to see a lot of handshake activity from BCG. It's definitely there, but not as much as, say, perhaps like McKinsey or Bain. So that's just something to keep in mind. So then the big four: Deloitte, EY, PwC, KPMG. They're called the big four because they originally started off, all of them, as accounting firms, and they all definitely still have accounting arms within their firms. But over the past few decades, they've spun out their own version of consulting, which is called advisory. So when you see advisory, generally it still means consulting. It's probably the branch within one of the big four firms. But all four of these firms recruit at Georgetown, though I will say Deloitte, EY, PwC recruit way more aggressively than KPMG. KPMG within the past year has begun recruiting again or rather just wanting to establish more of a presence at Georgetown. They mostly focus on tax, but it doesn't mean they're not open to Georgetown students going into advisory, but it may just take a little bit more of networking. But, reliably, Deloitte, EY, PwC, right? They recruit at Georgetown reliably every year. So next bucket, these are some of the other strategy and management consulting firms. Of course, like I said, right, this is not all of them, but this is just a slice of a few that recruit at Georgetown. Accenture and IBM, right, both big on innovation, both big on tech consulting. Accenture also has a federal services branch. Kearney, which is a more management consulting firm. I know that they do a lot of different consulting projects, but they specialize in supply chain, and I can tell you that they probably had a really great year addressing supply chain issues, right, as a result of the pandemic. And then LEK, which is probably in like the second tier of elite firms in terms of strategy, right, just below MBB. And then you have some boutique firms. So whether it's, you know, mid-sized or they focus on specific industry. You have advisory board. They do a lot of healthcare consulting, among other things, and there's a variety of others too. AG stands for Analysis Group. They're big on economic consulting. Alvarez and Marcel, A&M, they do public sector consulting, among other things. Ankura, I want to say, does defense consulting in addition to economic consulting, I believe. Senseo, also, I want to say economic consulting, but my be broader than that. So like I said, take it with a grain of salt. But there's many more that recruit at Georgetown that I didn't have space to put on, right? Whether that's Berkeley Research Group, Gartner, Heidrick and Struggles as HR, right? So there's just a lot of firms that recruit at Georgetown. All right. So busting myths. These are some of the things that kind of get expressed to me during my appointments that I kind of wanted to address during this workshop. So what I hear a lot from students, right? I have to be in the MSP, or I don't have any specific business experiences or academic backgrounds, right? Can I still recruit for consulting? Absolutely. You don't need to be in an undergraduate business program to go into consulting. In fact, if you look at our first destination reports for previous graduating years, students across SFS, the college, and NHS all go into consulting in addition to students from the MSP. So they're not just looking for, business business students per se. The other thing that I've had alum tell me is that, especially as they're consultants in the field, the competitive advantage of an undergraduate business degree runs out before the end of the first year, which basically means like by the end of your first year on the job within consulting, you're all basically on an equal footing, regardless of what your academic background is. So don't be discouraged if you don't have, specific business backgrounds in or a specific consulting internship, which I'll mention later. That doesn't have to be the case, right? You're still very much eligible. So the next one, I must have prior consulting experience. I need a consulting internship to be able to go into consulting, right? I have to have like participated in some shape or form in consulting through my undergrad years in order to be considered. Nope, this is untrue. So I've seen students who have spent a summer working at a policy think tank, interning with a nonprofit, and or just like volunteering for something they're really passionate about, all managed to secure offers in consulting. This is a story that I commonly tell, but honestly, one of my friends in undergrad, he with air quotation marks, but he worked at a restaurant the summer before his senior year, and he still managed to go into IBM for consulting. Did he have a wide variety of other experiences that help, shape him in a very well-rounded into a well-rounded candidate? Yes. But what I am saying is that you don't need to have a consulting internship to be able to successfully get into consulting. I've heard of philosophy majors going into consulting. I've heard of theater production majors going into consulting. And so basically what I'm saying is like, you don't need to have a traditional business or consulting background in order to get into it. Next one, my GPA is a 3.6 and I'm doomed. Y'all, this is a great GPA. And honestly, like if you have lower than that, it's still probably a great GPA, right? So while GPA is one of the factors that are absolutely considered, right, I think in any job, there are many more things that recruiters are looking into, whether it's specifically your leadership and professional experiences, right? Of course, they'll look into your academics and they want to see, right, like what are some of the meaningful things that you're studying and, how does that influence what you choose to participate in? But recognize that GPA is just one factor of the holistic candidate. So I will say elite consulting firms, right, like MBB and probably LEK as well, they look for GPAs at 3.7 and above, while the big four, which was right, Deloitte, EY, PwC, KPMG, are generally happy with GPAs above 3.3. That may or may not change due to the pandemic, but just recognize that GPA isn't everything. And if anything, if you have a lower GPA than what I've mentioned, think about the narrative associated with your GPA, right? Can you talk about like how you had a harder time and how you rose above the challenge, right? Or, can you talk about like what are the things you've learned throughout your time at Georgetown that have helped you increase your GPA, right, in some shape or form? Just know that it's not everything. And if you do think it's potentially a weak part in your application, make sure you have a very strong and solid narrative, right, to accompany it. Because if you have a great story about, right, what you've learned from it and how you've improved, that may be a really great opportunity, right? And so that's just something to keep in mind. GPA isn't everything. So, all right, well, Julia, you told me, right, like I don't need to have this or that. Well, then what are the firms looking for, Let me tell you. So these are the four core attributes I would encourage anyone interested in consulting to strategically demonstrate about yourself, right? So the first one is leadership. Like I mentioned earlier, or actually, no, I did not mention this earlier. But so for leadership, you want to show that you know how to take initiative and possess ownership over projects. Whether you're 10 years on the job or 10 months on the job, right? They want to see that you're involved and dedicated in the process, whatever that looks like, right? They want to see how you've led previously through your extracurricular activities, or perhaps you led like fellow interns into doing XYZ, right? But they want to see those things, right? They want to see that you led or spearheaded or piloted, right? So, next one, teamwork. You are never siloed in consulting. I mean, you're always working in a team. To be fair, right? Each person will have their individual responsibilities, which is very understandable, but you're always going to be working in a team when it comes to consulting. So you want to intentionally highlight how comfortable you are collaborating with others, right? Working with X number of people in XYZ scenarios, so on and so forth, right? This is just something I encourage you to highlight. So, analytical, right? Whether it's quantitative or qualitative analysis, your interviewers will want to hear about how you know how to utilize data to tell a story, right? Do you know how to derive the most useful insights into actionable next steps? Um, these are just things to keep in mind. And I stress that it doesn't necessarily just have to be quantitative. It can also be qualitative analysis, right? If you spent a summer conducting like 20 to 30 interviews and you were able to code those interviews into specific research that you wanted to use, that's totally valid, right? That's still analytical, even if it wasn't with numbers. So making sure that you highlight those attributes are going to be really important. And then finally, problem solving. Like we mentioned before, right? Consulting is glorified problem solving. So the more that you can demonstrate you're comfortable with problem solving, whether that's diagnosing a problem, solving a problem, and or implementing a solution, the more you're signaling to them, hey, I understand what this industry is about, right? I understand what you're looking for. Here are the ways that I've demonstrated that, right? Through my experiences inside and outside the classroom, as a leader, right, outside of the classroom, or in my professional experiences, or maybe when I was volunteering, right? The more you can narrate and provide anecdotes and just concrete examples of how you've been able to accomplish things with a direct result on like something or another, it's going to heavily work in your favor. So these are the four core attributes that I highlight. I would also say that if you have any kind of like client and or customer service experience, that's always good to put on there, because in consulting you are working for a client, right? And so the more that you can demonstrate your comfort in like building those kinds of relationships, knowing customer service, the better off you'll be. Basically, right? They just want to know that they can put you in a room with a client and you won't like freak out and you won't go berserk. There's something called the airport rule, which is, based on who I'm interviewing, if our plane were to get like delayed, would I enjoy the company of the person I'm interviewing for like a few hours, right? So that's also another component of it. And then creativity is always great to highlight, right? Ways that you can think outside of the box innovatively, or perhaps entrepreneurially as well. So I would say these four core things on the screen right now are the most important things to highlight. The other things I mentioned, I would say, are a little more supplementary. All right. So recruiting preparation, what can you do, right? I broke it out into three boxes. So one, resumes and CL, cover letter. So, right, highlight how you demonstrate those core attributes, like I talked about earlier. You want to make sure you quantify your efforts. Oh, apologies for the typo, man. Make sure to quantify your efforts and accomplishments, right? And so when you're reading a big block of text, it can be very overwhelming. So including numbers, whether it's like, like I mentioned earlier, X number of people that you interviewed, you managed a group of X number of members, right? Or so on and so forth. You want to include numbers because it breaks up the eye, but also people will be drawn to those numbers and wanting to understand exactly what they mean. You want to personalize your cover letter and make a compelling argument for yourself, right? So do not regurgitate this is my personal pet peeve. Do not regurgitate phrases from your resume into your cover letter. One, it's perceived as lazy, and two, you're repeating the same thing and not getting a new point across. What you want to do for your cover letter is write a narrative, right? That explains why are you a good fit for consulting? Why are you interested in the firm, right? What is your compelling argument that really makes me want to meet you as a person after reading your cover letter and sifting through your resume, right? And I'm just a plug, right? You can get your resume and cover letter reviewed by staff and peer advisors at Cawley throughout the course of the summer. Just putting it out there. Next thing that you want to prepare for are case interviews. Case interviews are unique to consulting, right, in general. So what they are open-ended business problems that are a unique, yes, right, the open-ended business problems. Sorry, I should not read off the slides. Basically, employers source case interviews from very pared down, sanitized versions of their own client projects. And what they're looking for is to test your problem solving, analytical, and communication skills. They're not trying to see you get to the exact solution that they offered as a firm. And real talk, how could you, right? They had a team of people working on this for like anywhere between 6 to 10 weeks. You as an interviewee cannot possibly get to the entire breadth and depth of the solution in the span of 30 minutes, right? Ultimately, what they're looking for is, can you clearly communicate your thought process of how you would go about solving this problem? And can we watch you explain as your mind works quickly to solve this problem in an analytical and rational manner that we can follow? Know that case interviews are not something you can master in a day. You can't cram for them. If someone said they mastered it in a day, I don't care who they are, they're probably lying to you, right? The best way to be able to master case interviews is committing yourself to routine practice. And when I say this, I'm not saying you need to do like 8 to 9 hours a day. Please don't do that. Like with anything, when you're studying, returning to the subject matter, returning to the process again and again is going to be most helpful. And I will detail this a little bit later on in the presentation about what you can do over the summer. And then finally, within recruiting, there's networking, right? And ultimately, networking is cultivating relationships, and you want to do that with both recruiters and alums so that you can get an understanding of their hiring timelines. What does their firm culture look like, right? What are cool projects that they get to be staffed on, and what has that experience been, so on and so forth. The more exposure you get through networking, the more one, they get to learn about you, right, and meet you as a candidate. And now you're not just a name on a resume or a cover letter, but you're a real person that they have an impression of, right? Hopefully positive. The other thing is that the more you network, the more you get to learn more about the firm, and the more you get to use that information, right, in a cover letter or in an interview. So if you're explaining why you're interested in a firm, it's going to come off like you really did your homework, and the efforts of your networking will go much further if you're able to explain like, oh, in my conversations with so and so, I recognize that the firm has gone through a lot of far lengths to be able to improve in XYZ manner, right? Or their culture is big on blah blah blah, right? It's not just about like what can you find from the website that makes this sound like a presentable cover letter, but what are the real conversations you've had with people in the firm that demonstrate not just your interest, but your commitment to being a part and or contributing, right, to what the firm brings. You can absolutely, right, utilize information sessions and coffee chats throughout the course of the semester to secure contact info from alumni that will generally be there. You can also cold email alumni as well. And then finally, for networking, not just within consulting, but honestly, whenever you're networking, just understand that every interaction is an opportunity for them to evaluate you. So that's not to say you need to have like every second of every conversation pre-planned in your mind, but go into a conversation making sure you have at least a few questions and knowing what you want to get out of it. Great. So the next most common question that I get, recruiting timeline, right? What does this look like? There is a slight caveat, which I will get to towards the end of the slide. But first, right, throughout the course of September and October, there will be information sessions, networking events like coffee chats, roundtables, case interview workshops, right, so on and so forth throughout the course of September and October. We have not, I'll get to that caveat later, but that's just something to keep in mind, right, for September and October. I recognize that the application deadlines and first round interview squares kind of happen during those information session blocks and even a little bit before it. But I will say, so there are definitely, right, some firms that will hold their information sessions perhaps in early October, and they just follow a different recruiting timeline. But the ones I'm about to walk you through are what we typically see historically over many years for some of our more larger employer partners, right? Like MBB, the Big Four, LEK, Carney, so on and so forth. Do not take this as like gospel, right? This is based on historical information and it's up to the whim of a company whether or not they want to change it. But this is generally what we see, right? So the blue squares with SR in parentheses are senior timelines. So seniors, your application deadlines, some of them are as early as July, which I'll mention at the end of the slide. But generally, they happen anywhere between early September to mid September, deadlines, right, to apply. And then there's a roughly kind of 2 week turnaround between applications and interviews. So, first round interviews kind of happen between mid September all the way to early mid October. And then your final round interviews will be scheduled anywhere between late October, November, and December. So the final round interviews, there's going to be a lag and it's going to perhaps not happen as promptly as the turnaround between your application deadline and your first round interview, simply because when it comes to a final round interview, the HR recruiters are bringing in many more people into the conversation to vet you, right? Because you're at the final stages of potentially joining their firm. So whether that's managing partners and partners, and other just generally managers and associates and analysts, many more people are brought into the mix, and there's just, right, more logistics involved in that, more conversation after the fact. So that's why final round interviews can happen over a larger spread of time in comparison to first round interviews, which are generally just conducted perhaps by like one alumnus and an HR recruiter and or our contact. And so that's why. For juniors, right, who are interested in internships, you'll notice that the process of recruiting for you is a little bit staggered. And the reason for that is because seniors come first and then it's juniors. So your application deadlines are more roughly between mid-September and late September. And then your first round interviews as a result is probably from like late September at the earliest throughout the course of October. And then your final round interviews generally land between like late October to November and December. What I can reliably say is that, especially for our larger firms who recruit their cohorts earlier, you will know by the end of fall semester whether or not you have an offer. For some people, this is really scary. For some people, this is really reassuring. Know that though this is what we've historically seen, it doesn't mean that if it takes them longer to respond, like after December, it doesn't mean that like you might not get an offer, right? Firms operate on their own timelines. There's a lot of things shifting day in and day out. And sometimes there are some firms that may have to pause the process and resume spring semester because they're working on like workforce numbers, right? There's also going to be smaller and mid-sized firms who don't follow this recruiting timeline whatsoever, simply because they don't need to recruit someone 8 to 9 months in advance, right? They'd rather recruit you a month, 2 months in advance of like when you could actually start working. So recognize that though there's a very large number of firms that will follow this recruiting timeline, you will still have other opportunities to interview and recruit for consulting, though probably not in as structured of a manner for your spring semester or just even later into your fall semester. Hopefully that makes sense. If you have questions, right, feel free. We're almost at the end, so definitely ask if you have any questions about that. And then, so like I mentioned earlier, but again, I want to stress, right, these timelines are geared towards undergrads. And currently, this is all based on historical information. I can't even tell you what's set in stone yet because we have not opened the fall semester to our employers to secure dates for information sessions, first round interviews, so on and so forth. So I feel relatively comfortable saying it'll probably fall somewhere along these lines, but the kind of day and age we live in, anything can happen. But like I mentioned earlier, right? I know that these timelines are geared towards undergrads. I don't know if for specialty master's programs it's different, right? Do they have to consider you for a different cohort simply because you have more technical skills, right? As a result of your program. Like I said earlier, you will want to do perhaps more networking to talk to people to figure out the answer in terms of, right, what are the applications I should be applying for and be considered for? Are they to be considered for the entry level analyst positions? Or is it, by a factor of how many years since I've graduated since undergrad, my work experience, and my current program that I could be considered for an associate level position, right? I'm not the right person to answer those questions. I would default asking those questions to either your program managers, perhaps professors in your programs, and or definitely like alums that have secured roles in the kinds of companies you're looking into, because they're going to be able to give you the best idea and perhaps even more tailored advice on how to move forward. So that's just something to keep in mind. Great. So what resources can you utilize, right? So first, Cawley, you know, feel we're open kind of in person, but not really. The majority of our meetings are all honestly still virtually. But stop by Cawley virtually, right? You can have your resume and cover letter reviewed. You can conduct a mock interview. I have a business finance and consulting industry newsletter that goes out on a monthly basis right now for the summer, and then it will be weekly once recruiting starts up again. If you just go to the Cawley website and Google business finance, or if you just Google on the Cawley website industry newsletter, you'll be able to find the sign up for it. But there's a lot of opportunities that Cawley offers when it comes to just having your resume reviewed, right? Mock interviews. If you ever want to work through like what is your elevator pitch, right? So on and so forth, we're happy to help you. Next resource, Handshake. So Handshake is the main platform where firms post events, right? If you have to apply for a coffee chat, that's where Handshake is where you'll do that mostly, as well as any internship and full-time job postings. They may also use the platform for first round interview signups. This has looked a little bit differently this past year because they didn't have to sign up using our interview rooms, but some of them, even if it's through their own virtual interview platform, they wanted to sign up through Handshake for first round interviews for their candidates. It's a moving target, but all of that is to say Handshake can be a really useful place. What I will also note though is that do still make a habit of checking the firm's websites, especially if you're really interested in them. For instance, right, like I said earlier, BCG doesn't always necessarily post things on our Handshake page, but that doesn't mean that they're not having webinars, right? And so make it a habit of also checking the firm's pages so that you can stay most updated as well. Right, it's not a guarantee that, I'm going to use BCG as an example again. It's not a guarantee that BCG will post their entry level positions on Handshake. They probably will, but they may not, right, for whatever reason. So it's good for you to be able to go to BCG or any of the firms that I mentioned, Accenture, IBM, Analysis Group, whatever, right? Going to their career pages and making sure you're signed up and alerted, especially if they're a firm that you're really interested in. So the onus will be on you for that one, but that's also something to keep in mind. And then the next resource that you should consider taking advantage of is the Georgetown Alumni Network. Alumni are really willing to help current students, right? I've never met an alumnus that wasn't willing to help out a current student. Like they may not be able to do it immediately, but generally they're pretty happy to help, right? Like I mentioned, even if they don't respond to your emails immediately. So I'd encourage you to utilize both LinkedIn, Hoya Gateway, and the information sessions that are forthcoming to be able to connect with alumni to get their perspective, right? Ask them questions about their experience in the industry, right? What was it like for them navigating recruiting, and really take the advice that they offer and utilize it in some shape or form. Great. And then, so next steps. What now, right? What can you be doing over the summer to prepare? So I would encourage you to be doing these three things simultaneously. I it's not necessarily like doing A, B, then C, but you can be working on all three of these categories throughout the course of your summer, right? So for resumes and cover letter, of course, you want to update your resume with your most recent GPA, update it with any new leadership titles that you've acquired for any of your extracurricular activities that you're a part of, right? Student orgs that you lead, so on and so forth. Maybe if you like co-founded an initiative or a new organization, right? That's something you want to put in your resume. And then, of course, as the summer progresses, whatever you're participating in over the next 2 months, whether it's an internship, a research experience, volunteering, so on and so forth, making sure that that is also um, accurately reflected on your resume. The other thing that you'll want to do is to draft a cover letter template that can easily be adapted to suit a firm. So, what I mean when I say this is that you want to, for your cover letter, like the body paragraphs are generally going to stay the same, right? From firm to firm, because they're looking, right? Many of them are looking for those core attributes that I mentioned earlier: leadership, teamwork, um, analytical abilities, problem solving, right? So those body paragraphs are probably not going to change much, but what you absolutely should change is your intro paragraph where you explain why you're interested in the firm, right? And name drop whomever you talk to. That is the main thing that you're going to want to change. And perhaps you can't write that until you have participated in some networking or whatnot. But what I would say is that at least the body paragraphs you can really refine and hone in on over the course of the summer and make sure they're in good shape before you apply or before you finalize the cover letter, I guess. So case interviews. Like I said earlier, don't drill them for 8 to 9 hours a day or anything. All you need to do is begin dedicating a few hours a week for practice. What I generally recommend, especially if you're kind of starting from step one, is to read a guide so that you can understand what are the common kinds of cases that you'll likely face in an interview. What are the structures you can utilize to guide your answers? There are books like Case in Point, Case Interview Secrets that you can utilize. There's also guides online if you want to try those first without spending the money, to see what they say and see if it's helpful enough. But honestly, as soon as whatever you pick, right? Like I don't necessarily advocate for one resource or another because I think different things work for different students. Just find some kind of thorough guide that will walk you through it in a way that you understand. But once you're done reading through the guide, then really begin practicing your cases, right? I would encourage you to maybe run a few cases. And then once you begin running through cases, you're going to understand where you feel perhaps weaker in, and then where perhaps you feel like you nailed it. So maybe you're really good at setting up your solution, but you're not really great at mental math, right? So then what you'll want to do is strategically drill down on mental math, so you can add and subtract, multiply and divide large numbers really quickly and know that that's not going to be a stumbling block during a case interview, right? It could look very differently for many different people, but you just kind of want to rinse and repeat this process of figuring out what you're weaker at, drilling down, strengthening it, right? And then doing an entire case again, seeing how you've improved, but also noting like where else you still need additional drills, and then right, rinsing and repeating that process. We're right in the second week of June. I would say you can start your case interview prep now, but I would say at the very latest start next month, start by July. Yeah, I think that would just give you the most amount of time in terms of practicing case interviews, especially with some of the deadlines that are coming up, which I will mention later. And then networking, right? So you can absolutely reach out to alum and begin networking. I will note, especially if you all either have recruited for finance before or have friends that recruited in finance, networking for consulting is not quite so relational in air quotes, right, as finance. It's not about contacting a large number of people. Honestly, for networking for consulting, it's much more transactional. You literally only need one person that will say like, yes, I will refer you. And that's going to streamline and facilitate the process immensely, right? And so, what you do want to do for networking is, right, figure out what your target firms are and then make a list of some alums that you can talk to. Specifically for consulting networking, you should set the agenda for what you want to talk about and make sure within the discussion, however long, right, it ends up being, that you prepare an elevator pitch about yourself. You may not need to pitch it, but make sure it's prepared, because if that opportunity comes up, right, you want to highlight what you have to offer, right? The combination of your leadership, your extracurricular, and your professional experience, oh, and academic experiences and professional experiences, right, that make you the best fit. So that's just something to keep in mind. And ultimately, you want to ask for a referral, right, for the position you're hoping to apply to. Um, you don't have to do this, but it is the most streamlined way. Like I said earlier, um, what you would do if you did want to go this route is at the end of your phone call, you say, thank you so and so for your time. I really enjoyed speaking with you, and I learned a lot about your expertise, or I learned a lot from your expertise on blank blank blank. I was wondering if you'd be open to referring me for XYZ position. And then, right, either they say yes, in which great, you can trust that they'll do it because they really have, right, no reason to lie to you. Or they might say no, in which you graciously take it like a champ and say, thank you so much for your honesty. I really appreciate it. Could you provide me with any feedback on anything I can do to improve myself as a candidate? I'm really invested in wanting to put my best forward in the recruiting process for your firm, and I would love to take the next X weeks, X months to work on some things before I officially apply. Consultants, right, love providing feedback. So hopefully these alumni will give you the feedback, and then now you have some strategic steps on what you know you need to improve on before the recruiting season happens, right? So that's what you can get out of networking. And so last thing I will say, as I mentioned, timelines. So because I know we have very high striving students at Georgetown. So one thing that I will note, and let me go back to this slide. So the majority of firms do have application deadlines, starting in September, but this year, McKinsey and BCG both have earlier deadlines. And not only do they have earlier deadlines, they have multiple deadlines. So for McKinsey, whether you're interested in full-time or their internships, they have two deadlines, one on July 19th and one on September 16th. They stress that you should apply for the deadline that you feel most ready at. And really, I'm not saying that the July 19th is geared towards seniors, but what I am saying is that if you're a rising senior who has an internship that will probably likely have a full-time offer, but you want to see if, right, you can make it at McKinsey, that earlier deadline is probably going to be better suited to you. Because you're probably working right against the timeline. Also, sorry guys, I recognize it's 5:58. I'll stay a little bit afterwards in case you have questions, but if you need to drop off, feel free to do so. It's close to dinner time. I get it. So yeah, just wanted to lay that all out. But yes, McKinsey, right, has those July 19th and September 16th deadlines. It's not that if you apply for July 19th, you'll have an edge just because you're applying earlier. They'll have an equal number of spots that they're trying to fill between the two deadlines. So apply for the date that you feel most ready at. And this is what our recruiter said to me. The other thing, though, that I have to mention is that if you apply for the earlier deadline, so let's say you apply for July 19th, you will know by early September whether or not you have an offer. If you have an offer, fantastic. If you don't, you cannot reapply for the September 16th deadline. You are not eligible. So that's what they mean when they say put your best foot forward for the deadline that you feel most prepared at, because that's it, right? For BCG, I believe their deadlines are July 16th and September 8th for full time. And then for summer internships, I believe they have I know they have 3 deadlines. It's July 16th, September 8th, and September 29th. And again, and to be fair, it's not like I met with the BCG recruiter, but I imagine like if they have multiple deadlines, it'll probably be the same thing as I mentioned earlier, right? Apply when you feel most ready and know that if you are rejected from one recruiting cycle, you can't uh, apply for subsequent ones. So that's just something to keep in mind. Um, so with that, that concludes the presentation. Let me stop recording.